Welcome, Outlanders, to another episode of Vigor Dev Talks. I'm your host, Tony. Today, I am joined by none other than the man, the myth, the black metal legend himself, Michal, our senior technical designer. Michal, thanks for being here today with us.
Hello, thanks for having me.
Some people from the community might be very well familiar with you, but for the listeners who maybe don't know who Michal is, would you care to briefly introduce yourself?
Well, I am me. I am, as you said, senior technical designer here in Vigor. I've been in the company, well, at this point it actually counts in years, so that's cool. And yeah, well, what my job usually is implementing new features from the designs that we get from designers, fixing a whole bunch of bugs, and just dealing also with some quality of life upgrades and whatnot if there's time for that. And also part of my responsibilities, since I'm leading the technical design team, is also all the administration and distributing work and the sort of logistics of the team. So that's sort of the stuff.
Mm-hmm. So for the people who might not be very familiar with the details in game dev, what's the difference between a designer and a technical designer?
Yeah, well, when speaking generally about game dev, it's a little bit trickier because they're not really terms that are well defined by anyone. Designer is a little bit more easier to grasp because it usually fits into the same category, but then like bigger studios tend to then also divide it and specify it into literally gameplay designers, narrative designers, monetization designers, or whatever their needs are. But then when it comes to technical designers, it's kind of tricky. Some studios actually call the same kind of position scripters, some call it technical designers. In some studios, it might actually fall into programming, even, I think. So it almost feels sometimes like a bit of a jack of all trades in a sense. But the difference mainly is that designers are those responsible for literally coming up with new stuff, new ideas for the game. Like they decide, okay, we want to have this kind of a feature and it's gonna happen this way and players will interact with it this way. And we want it to do that, and we want flashy lights here and a pop-up there, and we want the players to feel good about this and stuff like that. Mm-hmm. And then it sort of falls down to technical designers to take that kind of design and figure out the feasibility, figure out how it should be implemented into the game, into the systems that are already in place, what risks there are, what are the limitations, edge cases. In our team, it also works in tandem with programmers, in the sense that for those things that fall onto us technical designers, we then potentially ask programmers for some help with some underlying mechanics, whether it's on the level of the engine itself or rendering or stuff like that. That's, for simplicity's sake, more complex perhaps. But yeah, it involves, the difference specifically involves the technical designers. We are already responsible for implementation and less for coming up with stuff. Our designers are those that actually figure out what they want to have in the game and then communicate that to us.
But let's say your job is to take the idea and turn it into a reality, or see how possible is it to turn it into a reality?
Yeah, like a bit of both.
Yeah. So is there any chance that the design itself will have some problems or issues that the technical design department or scripters will find out after trying to implement it? Or
it happens.
Yeah.
Well, usually what we try to do, and what I also personally try to do, is always be, as I suppose you could say, critical of the designs that I get, and try to go over them, try to look for specifically like all the edge cases. It's part of my, well, literally programmer mentality that I've developed over years being a programmer. Is I don't really care what is the most probable or like most common situation that will happen. I need to know what are the edge cases, because everything will be between those edge cases. I need to know what are the limitations, because they still need to be, set up. There still needs to be, essentially the game needs to be taught how to deal with those, even if it happens 1 in 100 cases.
So you want to know the boundaries, basically.
Yeah, basically, yeah. So I always try to do that, but obviously with more complex mechanics, there's a tendency that you won't be able to like go over everything. Sometimes things change, and especially in Vigor, since we're at this point already working on a live game that's been out, it's not just a product that already has some shape, but it's still heavily work in progress. We have the limitation of, well, we have to deal with what we have. So we already have mechanisms in place. We already have a pretty large code base that we work with, which means that my job then becomes a little bit more complicated because I have to consider that within those limitations, but not always you can do that efficiently, and not always you can do that before you actually start implementing. So as you said, like many times, sometimes it happens that we start implementing, we go through half of the implementation, or we almost have the thing done, and we realize, well, there's just this one pop-up that you guys wanted to show, and like we literally can't do that without rewriting, a whole bunch of code that would take us weeks of work. Or sometimes we find out that like, yeah, we were counting on like having also this kind of data displayed in the game, and then we realize, well, but we don't actually have a way to get the data. And suddenly that can actually snowball, because then you realize, well, if we don't have the data, we can't display it in the game, but then that means that the whole part of UI that was dedicated to displaying the data suddenly has nothing in it. So we take it away, but now half of the screen is empty. So we have to go back to the UI design, and you have to like rework that. So it then still leads to these kind of snowball situations, and it happens. But mostly we try to do this upfront and try to figure out as much as we can before we actually start implementing.
Right.
That's part of the job of technical design as well. And I try to do that a lot to, as I mentioned, like be as critical as I can. So I try to go through all the stuff, check that we actually have everything that we need, that we can do everything that designers want us to do, and address those things before we actually start working on it.
Okay. So for the people listening right now who want to get into game dev, let's say either in the technical design department or scripters or something like this, how does one actually become a technical designer? Like, what are the check boxes that you need to tick if you want to go down this path?
So, I mean, speaking like generally about game design or like game development, sorry. Well, the first and foremost, or like most important step is just to be interested in it, because if you're not interested in it, you're never gonna, like, even if you get to a place where you have a position, you find a studio or whatever, you won't be able to like really delve into it, it won't work, right? And at that point, it varies obviously depending on different positions. I look at it from a perspective of how should I call it, like the implementation force behind games. My background is in programming, so what I did was I did some game jams, I did some events like that. I did some of my own projects where I was just essentially literally coding something that most of the time you would barely call a game, but it did something. It moved, it blinked or flashed or whatever. There was some sound or stuff like that, and it helped a lot to like develop certain approach to things. And then with game jam especially, because game jams are built around the idea that you just like power through it, and like you are motivated to create a product at the end, no matter the quality, but it's something that should be, playable at least to some extent. And that also helps in terms of portfolio, because then when you're applying to companies for a job, oftentimes what we look at, and especially now as I'm a team lead for a while now, and I have gone through this process at this point actually several times, and I've seen a whole bunch of CVs, I've seen a whole bunch of candidates as well. What we generally look at isn't really, what's written on the paper. We want to see the skill. So even here we have the process of having essentially some sort of like an entry task that the candidate gets, and it's literally practical exercise almost.
Yeah, just to see their knowledge, where they're at.
And so what we literally do, we tell them to basically make a small game. It's very simple, but then we look at the outcome. We check the quality of the code, try to read the mentality behind the code, so like how the candidate was thinking about it, and that tells us a lot about whether they would be a good technical designer or not. But it varies from different positions, so and obviously with different technologies as well. But the idea is still there. Like for the implementation, you want someone that is capable of thinking about the code on almost the abstract level, because ultimately the code is just a tool, right? So if you don't know how to use it, it doesn't help. And so for becoming a technical designer, it really just comes down to two things. And it sounds really simple, almost stupidly simple. Just keep looking and definitely exercise in terms of literally programming skills. And it doesn't even have to be necessarily games. Just do a lot of programming, any kind of programming exercises. If it helps, just find yourself like a part-time job of, I don't know, helping someone with some apps or whatever. but it keeps you going. It gives you a good, almost like a muscle memory in terms of the technologies, and try different technologies as well, and that will also help you. And so when you end up in a situation that you find a good opportunity and you send in your CV and they write you back being like, well, I mean, sure enough, like you seem like a decent candidate here, I don't have a task or whatever, you'll be in a much better place to actually do that. And you'll also have much better chances of getting some kind of task, because it's not really as much the CV that I feel people look at, and that includes me when I pick candidates. Obviously, I do have a look at it, but then ultimately it's, like I mentioned before, portfolio, for example. So I want to see if that person already has some games out there, and it doesn't have to be like a AAA game on Steam. It can be literally a small project somewhere on itch.io, which is like a simple visual novel or a point-and-click adventure with like 5 screens or something.
But still, it shows that the person did something and actually invested time and energy into doing this.
Yeah. And with some experience, you know, and this I mean on my side, I can then at least extrapolate a little bit the skill level required for that kind of project, and what, again, mentality was behind it and whatnot. So it helps a lot to create a good idea about the person. And then obviously we get the task which gives us much more information, because we actually get the whole project back. We can look at the code, we can investigate and inspect everything within it. So that way we can really look in, you know, deeply into the mentality. And if people realize this and they work on these skills, I think that gives them pretty decent opportunities, basically, or at least chances. The opportunities are basically there. I mean, game dev is a pretty large industry. Obviously, in different areas of the world, it works a little bit different, but at least when it comes to programmers and, how should I call it, like adjacent positions, I think that there's always going to be somewhere some studio that is desperately looking for people like that.
Yeah. So folks, you heard it here from Michal himself. Basically, just keep on at it, you know, keep trying, keep experimenting, keep harnessing your skills. And as we said, definitely a background in programming is needed.
One thing that I haven't mentioned, but it gets a little bit trickier, because then you actually end up having a lot more regional differences, is education, obviously. It's not key part at least from my point of view, it's not key element in terms of like any formal requirements necessarily, but there are some good schools that actually give you a really good overview of stuff. Whether it's just general, you know, programming, computer science, or specifically schools that literally teach game dev oriented courses, ranging from design through like some, you know, audio and art to programming, but it also actually fits into the whole context. So you already get some, if not experience, at least a little taste of the production process and everything. So when you actually get into a studio, it feels somewhat familiar at least. But yeah, I mean, like I said, it sort of regionally dependent, because obviously these schools aren't everywhere, these programs aren't everywhere. So.
Obviously, yeah. So it's just basically everybody has to work with the tools that they have and the means that they have available to them, right? So now that we talked about how does one become a technical designer, let's follow through with what do you think are some of the qualities that make somebody a good technical designer that stands out from others?
Right, yeah. I mentioned a little bit, you know, the mentality, which is like a very vague term, and doesn't really say much. And we could probably talk about a whole bunch of like smaller things here and there. But the thing is, ultimately, the most important thing, or perhaps two things when it comes to technical designer, and this applies to other professions as well, whether it's programmers and whatnot, but it's definitely, you know, ability, like problem-solving ability, and with that related like critical thinking, as well as the ability to learn and grasp new things. And if you have those two things, it's gonna happen. There doesn't really stop you. Like there's not much that will stop you from it. And if you actually then push forward, you will become a good, whether it's technical designer or programmer, doesn't really matter. Because ultimately that's sort of at the bottom of those professions. I mean, even when I described it briefly before, the thing is like whether it's implementing new features or fixing bugs, it's always a variation of problem solving. It's essentially like a puzzle. It's like if you had literally either like a Tetris, a Rubik's Cube, or literally, I mean even Tetris, or like whatever other puzzle
that you need to solve.
That you need to solve. It's always this, because you always have certain elements that you have to put together.
Yeah.
But when it's bug fixing, it's more like a mystery investigation, when you're looking for what the quote unquote crime is, and then looking for the culprit, which, you know, many times ends up being you yourself. But yeah, it's you're looking at something that goes wrong and you're looking for the reason behind it. But with implementation, it's sort of the same thing, but from the other side. There isn't a problem yet, but you're trying to build it so there aren't any problems. You try to avoid problems. You try to figure out how to fit a piece of a jigsaw puzzle somewhere in there, right?
That fits perfectly and doesn't cause any problems.
Exactly. And that comes down to like this problem-solving skill and critical thinking about it, being able to analyze the design that you have, the idea behind it, understand what is actually required, not just like, oh, we want you to put, I don't know, this UI here, this UI there, this mechanic here, but realize what it all means, what's the point behind it, and then being able to feedback the design by saying, well, I see what you want to do, but we can't fit it quite like this, but if we twist it a little, we can still do the same idea, but, you know, in a different way. And then will actually then lead to efficiency, because otherwise you would either try to brute force it, or you would basically just say, well, we can't do it. And you would either create a lot of issues or lose the idea completely, right?
And you don't want either of them.
Yeah. So like looking for those optimal solutions is definitely the key. And then obviously the ability to learn and grasp new things comes with the idea that, especially like in game dev, we use a lot of different tools. And if you end up going from a job to a job, from a studio to a studio, you might end up changing these tools even frequently. So, and even with like modern, like progressing technologies, you've got technologies that become obsolete and are just replaced by new ones, right? New version of the engine that you're working with. And suddenly, you know, one thing that you're working with works in a completely different way and you have to relearn it, basically. So again, if you're not good at it, you're gonna struggle. But if you're really good at it, you're gonna actually power through it and
adapt faster
and become much more efficient. So that will make you, what you said, good technical designer.
And so you talked about like some tools that you use, and you might change them depending on where you work and what kind of studio. So what are some of the tools that you use for your day-to-day work?
Well, specifically for Vigor, Vigor is built on Unreal Engine as the underlying tech that keeps the whole game running. And that, you know, without going into too much detail, because in general, or generally speaking, you would have the game engine, but that can also contain like all kinds of additional, whether it's just small add-ins and whatnot, but sometimes a whole new technology that is connected, whether it's a whole separate physics engine or audio system and stuff like that. But for me, we generally work with just for the most part, the basic Unreal technologies. And then generally speaking, like these game engines are also, that there's a variety on the market. So
yeah, definitely.
Talking, you know, generally, again, it is a tool and they're very specific, even though some skills are transferable. But I myself have found that like, I've tried pretty much, I think, all like the major engines that are out there at some point, whether it's like professionally or just for my own projects and whatnot. And I did find that it required certain degree of actually learning to work with them, because while the basic paradigm is the same, but it's still a tool. Yeah.
It doesn't mean that if you know one engine, you know every engine, right?
Exactly. So that's one thing, right? And then another thing is obviously, because even though we're not directly programmers, we also work with the code, with like directly the code itself. So that means also some IDEs, which is basically, for those that don't know, it's IT talk. It's basically a development environment. It's fancy talk for a very, very powered up text editor that allows you to edit the code, but also run it, debug it, do all kinds of stuff with it. So we use that. Also, as I mentioned, like a lot of text editors as well. And then any kind of additional tech that helps me, whether directly with the development of the game itself or any tools on the side. I end up finding myself coding a couple completely separate tools that aren't part of the game itself. They just run somewhere on the side, or, you know, I use them when I need to speed up some processes and stuff like that. And that involves like coding in some additional, you know, languages with some additional tech that we normally don't use. But that's sort of like the core. And then obviously in terms of the whole production, and again, well, some folks will be familiar with it because I'm pretty sure that we've mentioned a couple of times on streams and in various videos. But for production tracking and all that, we use Jira and Confluence, which are one of the most commonly used software solutions of that kind. And they're literally just software solutions to keep track of tasks, literally, just a task to, well, here have a task to implement this
Yeah,
mechanic.
all the tickets that we have, depending on like different tasks that
Yeah. And then Confluence is literally just used for keeping track of all the documentation and designs. So that whole thing sort of combos together along with communication tools that we use internally.
Yeah.
To mostly create a smooth and seamless ride. And then occasionally it gets funny.
Occasionally, yeah, we send a couple of funny memes here and there so we can have a bit of a laugh. Cool. So, having been on the Vigor team for quite a while now, what would you say is the feature that was the most challenging but also the most satisfying?
You mean for me or in general?
For you.
For me, I know. I've worked on a few challenging features, but we ended up, again, going back to like the whole critical thinking and a little bit of creativity into that as well. That always helps. We almost always ended up kind of, it's not really taking an easy route, but like not going against the grain. Instead of like rebuilding certain existing mechanisms, we literally just ultimately like disconnected the old implementation and build it from scratch, which turned out to be much easier, at least to whatever extent we could. So when it comes to like challenging, I remember few features that when we were designing them, when we came up with the idea of like we want to do that, it felt really daunting and it felt like we were really going to put a lot of effort into it. And then ultimately it turned out that like it was still a lot of work, but like we ended up doing it efficiently by bypassing certain risky
Work smart, not hard.
Yeah. But I would say that maybe the most challenging, but also the one that I feel was most rewarding, both from my perspective, but I think also for players, was leaderboards, specifically the leaderboards we work, which we've known about leaderboards and we've heard the feedback from players for quite a while. But again, it was one of those things that was in the game for a long time in one form, or the other, and we knew that like manipulating with it would be difficult. But ultimately, we actually went through with it. We've come up with a whole new design that would expand the possibilities, and we found a way to work with the system in such a way that it helped us to rebuild the implementation behind the leaderboards, and that opened up possibilities that we didn't have before, right? So we were able to offer leaderboards in additional game modes, which we didn't have, as well as change the way how they're tracked across different time ranges, basically.
Yeah.
So that felt really great to see how that challenge of that implementation turned out into something that actually felt like, okay, this is actually cool. This looks much better and works much better than the version that was there before.
It does. It 100% does. And I think based on the feedback from the community, everybody really appreciated all the hard work and effort that went into like redesigning basically this whole feature and re-implementing it, making it better, making it more diverse, making it more dynamic. I think everybody really appreciated the effort from the team. And I'm pretty sure it must have been a little bit of a hell for you.
Oh, I mean, definitely. Like it was, I think that from all the challenging features, this might have been the most challenging, and it turned out to take a lot of time to the point that, well, it took longer than we initially anticipated. So we ended up spending a lot of time on it. But yeah, it was. We've also hit a few issues along the way that we had to solve. In a sense, sort of like I mentioned earlier when you asked about like if you discover some issues like before implementation, during implementation. And this was one of the cases where during implementation we realized, oh well, we wanted to have this in there, but we really can't. And then we wanted this to work in a particular way, but I don't think that's going to be possible. And you find out like mid-implementation while I sat down and I tried to actually code it, and I realized, oh wait, but I actually don't have the data for this to work. And we had to like go back, roll back some steps and figure out how to do it in a different way. So we were sort of, in a sense, hot fixing it as we went in the implementation, trying to figure out what we can do without the elements that didn't make it there, we couldn't actually implement. And then also I think with few things, we even ended up like adding few elements that we realized like, oh, hey, we could actually do that and it wouldn't be a lot of work.
But then it comes back basically to what you said, is those problem-solving skills.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So you were in a tough spot, but like having some sort of an experience, having confidence as well, finding the best way to tackle that problem with making as least of a fuss as possible.
Yeah. You always have to have that sort of approach, the cool head approach. And well, I'm not usually I'm not as much of a planner as more of an improviser, but you always have to have some idea of, I would call it like in a very metaphorical sense, always be aware of your exits, right? When you're somewhere, like it's just sort of like, I don't know, I think like a lot of thrillers and like spy movies and whatnot make a big deal out of it, like make sure that you know the exits of the room. And this is sort of like the same idea, right? Being able to realize that you're in a situation where you have a bunch of options, bunch of ways to go, and be aware of all the options. Like some of them might be really drastic, but be aware of them. And then when something happens and, you know, it all breaks or something, then you always can consider those options and figure out what you can do instead of just starting panicking like, oh no, it doesn't work, everything broke, and, you know, we won't have an update or something like that. And it was the same situation. And we actually were aware of those options, including, okay, we're going to scrap the feature. Like if we can't actually make it work, we're going to have to scrap it. And even if it meant scrapping months of work, you know, if you can't make it work, and if you can't like put it into the game so that it doesn't break anything else, then would be the only option. Like,
yeah, it would suck, but...
Yeah, unless there are other options in terms of, okay, we actually know we can fix this particular issue, and okay, we know that it will probably take around a month, and we are fine with it, and we're going to be like, okay, we are going to invest that month, risking that it might still not work out and whatnot. But like, it then ends up being that risk management in a sense.
Yeah.
But it begins with being able to, you know, to tell these options, being aware of them. And as you said, like when I was working on that implementation, it was really about, yeah, sure, we hit an issue, we found out that, okay, this doesn't work, but we were immediately like, okay, well, we can either do it without it, and that means that we have to do this sequence of steps and redo the design in a specific way, or we can try to like work around and try to at least get it working partially in some way and whatnot. Yeah. But you always are aware of those options and the consequences, so we actually knew it was sort of like just switching a rail or track, right? It's just like, okay, so now we're just gonna skip to a different track and we just keep going, right?
So always move forward, keep going, pedal to the metal.
Yeah.
That's game dev for you guys.
No regrets.
And as a final question, something more on the lighthearted side, what kind of a gamer are you, number one? What do you enjoy playing? And what is the one feature that really impressed you in a game that you would either like to see implemented in Vigor, or it just like really blew your mind about how it was designed and implemented?
Right. So, well, to the first part of the question, I mean, I'm not sure how I would describe myself as a gamer. I play a lot of games, but it's like mostly it's either RPGs or like strategy games and stuff like that. But I also like anything that is, I don't know, immersive or like atmospheric. So like one of my most favorite games would be games like Outer Wilds or The Longing. Recently, I think it was like sometime, I think before Christmas or something like that, I actually picked up Slay the Princess, which is basically, it is essentially like a visual novel. Which is not my usual genre that I would play, but that particular game, the way the story is built, it's really great. But like, I have a fairly large like range of games, and it depends also on mood and whatnot. So like, I'm a huge Souls fan, but then I also play, you know, economy builders as well and stuff like that. Even occasionally like simulators and whatnot. But yeah, it depends on the mood, I would say. And when it comes to feature, then it makes it, the question becomes somewhat difficult because, you know, with all the games that I play in different genres, it's hard to pick a feature because that feature would not work in many other games and whatnot. But I think that what I generally like is when games go, so what I would call it like when games go above and beyond, and they actually go a few extra steps that technically didn't have to be there. Like they don't necessarily affect the gameplay as much, but they bring in a lot of the atmosphere, they bring in a lot of the experience. So like in Souls games, it's like the way how they work with the environment as a narrative tool, and how they actually make the world itself tell a story. Especially, for example, when I played Elden Ring, I enjoyed it a lot to just like explore the world and try to like figure out the story of the world just from you know, taking a stroll, instead of just being like force-fed the whole narrative in form of just a block of text, which, you know, works by default, but it was really enjoyable to have that extra feeling of, you know, it's not just that I'm running around and you know, killing all the mobs and then, you know, failing at the boss fight and whatnot, but there was that extra layer to it. And similarly in Slay the Princess, and I don't want to spoil it too much, but it is a visual novel, but it has a really interesting meta element when it actually starts affecting, even to a degree, it starts affecting the way how the player actually interacts with the game as a game, not just like with the elements within the game. And again, like technically it just could have been a visual novel with like straightforward story and still a similar story, but like this went full crazy basically. And I really liked
but the best kind of crazy.
Yeah. It kind of broke the paradigm of like this kind of games, as well as, I don't know, I'm still coming up with, for example, in Hellblade: Senua's Sacrifice, the fact that like there's almost constantly the whispers of like the voices in the head.
Because it's immersive. You're supposed to feel like
it's immersive, but like, you know, strictly speaking, if it weren't there, the game would practically play the same way. The experience would be vastly different.
Oh yeah,
but
definitely.
gameplay wise, it changed nothing. Like
Definitely.
Sure, there are maybe like few points in the game where the voices actually kind of give you hints, but ultimately you would figure out those solutions probably by yourself. So it again feels just like that extra step that just improves the whole experience of it. And then again, like I mentioned, the longing, and then like the longing is a game that like takes 400 days to finish. And not like in-game days, like regular days. You start playing it at New Year's and you finish on Valentine's next year, right? So
you're very specific about that date. Like did it happen to you? You started playing on New Year's?
I don't think.
Valentine's?
I don't think. I just like my math kind of worked out that it would probably fit around that time.
Fair. Because it was oddly specific. I was wondering.
I suppose, but it was.
I was wondering.
It wasn't meant to be. And the thing is, like, and again, I like don't want to spoil, but like, by default it takes 400 days. But like, there are ways or things that you can do in the game that will like take away from the time. So like, I'm not sure what like the speed running record for this is. I would have to check, but it works with that real life time in that way, and it was really interesting to go through it. And then obviously like things like Baba Is You, which literally just breaks the rules of gaming in general. It's just like everything in the game is a rule, and you can literally just change how the whole game works completely. Not just like, oh, okay, now you don't have to like go to the flag, but you go to the door. But you can completely change the fact, like, oh, now you move the entire level around. Now the level is just a winning condition that it exists, right? And stuff like that. So like,
that's very outside of the box.
Yeah. Like exactly, like that extra layer of creativity and like extra layer of immersion for the sake of experience. I always tend to enjoy it. And whether it's like this really creative outside of the box thinking, or for example in Alien Isolation, it's just like the full ambience of the space station. That really always works.
Yeah, I'm also like a big sucker for this like immersion, environment, atmosphere. This always gives like extra points to the game, like outside of gameplay. Like it doesn't change the gameplay, but it always gives a few extra points to the game, and just like makes the experience just a little bit extra, a little bit more special. So that's it for us today, guys. That's our time. Michal, thank you very much for being with us today.
Yeah, it was fun.
We hope you guys enjoyed our talk. We hope you guys learned a few things about technical design. And as we said in the beginning, just keep at it and good things will come. And that's it from us today, Outlanders. Until the next time, see you in the Outlands. Bye.
Bye.